welcome to The Kill File, your favorite true crime podcast. I'm your host, Brittany, and each week we will explore the dark corners of true crime, unsolved mysteries, and murder. Join me as we uncover secrets, investigate evidence, and dive into the chilling details of some of the most fascinating cases. Get ready for a journey into the dark unknown, because in The Kill File, nothing stays buried forever. Hey guys, welcome to episode 7 of The Kill File. Today we're going to talk about a man named Charles Albright. This guy, oh boy, this story was just gripping for me. Like, I went down a deep rabbit hole and I was there for every moment of it. I am so excited to share this weird story with you all. Trigger warnings for today are rape, murder, body mutilation, and brief child molestation. So it is going to start right off the bat brutal, and then it will calm down a bit as I tell the story, but I needed to say that each of his victims were sex workers, just as a trigger warning for anybody who doesn't like that. So let's jump in. This time I want to start off by telling you what Charles Albright was charged with. Then we will kind of go back and forth from the murders to the timeline of him growing up and living his life until the last murder. All the way up until his death in 2020, he still insisted on his innocence. And I should also state that the police and the FBI never found any concrete physical evidence to link Charles to any of the murder cases, but there was a whole lot of circumstantial evidence, among other things. Okay, Charles was charged with 3 separate murders. On December 13th, 1990, a sex worker by the name of Mary Lou Pratt was killed by gunshot to the back of the head. When the ME went to do her autopsy, they discovered that both of her eyes had been removed and taken. Oh yes, that kind of guy. On February 10th of 1991, the body of another sex worker was found. A woman named Susan Peterson had been shot 1 time through the top of her head, and 1 time in the back of her head, and 1 time through her left breast. This woman's eyeballs were also taken. And finally, we have the last victim, who was also a sex worker named Shirley William. She had been shot twice, once through the back of her head and 1 went through her face. Shirley was unfortunately also beaten and had a broken nose. Shirley, too, was found missing her eyeballs. When an interviewer sat down with Charles in prison, Charles was said to be considerate and charming. He told the interviewer that he would never find a woman who would say anything other than how he was always a perfect gentleman in their presence. The interviewer had said he had almost a childlike and appealing nature, despite being described by authorities as one of the, quote, coldest and most depraved killer of women in the city's history. Charles had said that he enjoyed doing nice things for women, like painting their portraits, giving them presents, and taking their pictures. The interviewer stated that we usually see serial killers that are young and uneducated men who are lifelong sadists and who kill because they have some sort of twisted reason or twisted thoughts. He wondered how this man, who seemed to be polite, charming, and not harmful, could have been a sex-crazed murderer in his later years in his life. When the interviewer asked Charles why he thought the eyeballs were missing from the women, Charles said he didn't understand why they were gone. He went on to say that it must have been someone who was sadistic and a mean son of a gun. Charles went on to say that he didn't know the purpose of someone taking the eyes, unless someone had thought that these women wouldn't be able to see in the next world, which to Charles meant that he was ignorant. The interviewer then said, in reference to Charles's painting, that there was no question that Charles loved the eyes. He was a master painter. Charles responded with the fact that he wanted to be able to paint them well and that they were a weakness to other artists. The interviewer went on to ask him if he loved the eyes enough to, and then he was abruptly interrupted by Charles, who then said that he had never taken the eyes out of anything. He said he never had the desire to. He said the thing that mattered to him was how the eyeball looked inside of the woman or man's face. When the interviewer then asked Charles if he could think of a reason why someone would want to keep the eyeballs as a souvenir, Charles replied with the fact that he didn't think anyone would want to keep the eyeballs. He said for himself personally, it would have been the last thing that he would ever want to keep from somebody's body. He said that maybe he would keep like a hand or a whole head if you were the kind of, quote, sick artist that would be into that and had thought maybe the woman was so beautiful that he wouldn't want her beauty to go to waste. Later on in the interview, when Charles was asked about the true crime books that were found in his house, he replied with the fact that there were all kinds of books in his house, and that if he wanted to be a serial killer, he wouldn't have gotten caught on the third kill. He said that he did everything to the best of his abilities, still denying the fact that he was tied to anything. Ugh. If people tried to make the fact that true crime books in their house or on Google searches were what make people like serial killers, I would be screwed. I am pretty sure to the FBI or anyone else who's looking at my Google search that I look like a deranged psychopath. Okay, so who was Charles Albright? Charles was, for all intents and purposes, a well-behaved young boy who liked to please other kids. He was smart, fun for the other children to watch, and it even said that he liked to tap dance. Charles was adopted when he was 3 weeks old by Dell Albright and Fred, who was a local grocer in Dallas. They were a middle-class family who lived in an all-white neighborhood that was said to be across from a river and downtown Dallas. Dell told Charles later on in his life that his biological mother was a law student who was only 16 years old and had become pregnant after marrying another student in secret. However, when the young girl's father found out about the marriage and her pregnancy, he forced her to give up the baby for adoption and annul her marriage, or he would cut her off from the family. Which, I understand back then. This was in the late 40s at the time. It was like shameful for women to do certain things. But they probably got married so they wouldn't shame their family, because back then it was something that you basically had to do. At least it seemed like she wanted to try. However, I don't like the oppression of women in any era, whether they knew better or not. I absolutely cannot imagine somebody telling me that I have to give up my child. Like, fuck off. I would have been a hobo on the street with my baby. But she did what was probably the best thing for the baby and gave him up to have a better opportunity at life, which I commend her for, because I think I would have been too selfish and would have told my family to fuck off. Poor thing, like I can't even imagine the pain and the hurt for this young woman. Dell made sure to let Charles know that she would never abandon him, which good for her, because she told her son the truth and didn't make his mother seem to be any certain way if that was the truth. Even if it wasn't, I think it's cool that she gave him that story so that he didn't feel unwanted, but rather that his young mother had no choice. It was said that Dell pampered Charles even to the point that she kept goats in the backyard so that she could have goat milk for him instead of cow's milk, because she said it was better for him. That's awesome. Love to hear it when a mother goes the distance for her son like that. She probably wanted him so badly. It was also said that Charles's mother went to extremes. It said that his mother would change his clothes 2 to 3 times a day to keep the dirt off of him. It said that she would occasionally, and this part is a little different, but it said that she would sometimes put him in a little girl's dress and then give him a doll to hold. She would also take Charles to the hospital to see polio patients that were locked in huge iron lungs because she was afraid that he would touch dog poop and get polio. Which, that is a little odd. I think maybe even a little traumatizing. I don't know, but I feel like I can't judge her because polio is no joke. And low-key, I feel like this is something that I would do to drive a point home to my children about how important it is to stay away from, like, whatever it is. When you're trying to protect the thing that you love more than anything in this world, you sometimes do weird things to protect them. I get it. I'm the mom whose child's teacher literally once said in a parent-teacher conference that my son had seen another kid sneeze, and he told that kid to cover his sneeze the next time, and asked the kid if he knew that a sneeze could travel up to 18 feet. That is truth, and this was before COVID. I am that mom. I realized that my children listened to me in this moment, and his teacher and I had like a great laugh about it. She said, well, he wasn't wrong, but it made her laugh pretty hard. Sorry, not sorry. Dell would tell Charles that he would spend the rest of his life like the people that he was seeing with the iron lung. I can see why it was extreme, though, and I can see why she was said to be extreme. It said that when he was less than a year old, Dell put him in a dark room as punishment for chewing on her tape measure, which is so sad. Poor baby. Also, did he remember this, or how was this known? Because I was curious. Also, she apparently would tie him to his bed when he wouldn't take a nap, and she would spank him if he didn't drink all of his milk, which is also super sad. Dell was said to be a frugal woman who bought her clothes from Goodwill, despite the fact that her and her husband were far from poor. Which makes sense because this was probably right after the Great Depression. There is nothing wrong with being frugal. Charles would later say that he was grateful for all of the manners that his mother had taught him. He said that his mother would tell him to be polite or not say anything at all. She had even taught him to respect women, especially in the area of sex. Wow, this woman, besides her weird and seemingly too strict behavior, in my opinion, had some areas that were way ahead of her time. If she had taught her son at this time to be respectful of women, especially in the bedroom, I love it. Some of it's weird though. I read that she lectured Charles about how his father was greedy with sex. It said that when Fred, which is her husband, ever saw her in her bra and underwear, he tried to grab her. But she would have none of that and wanted to make sure that Charles would never try anything like that with his own girlfriends. Good for her. That's right. Husband or no husband, that is your body and it's your choice. It makes me wonder, though, if something ever happened to her at some point that made her like that, do you think? Or maybe even something that she saw? I'd be interested in knowing her history as well. For it to be this time period and for her to teach her son those morals, I have a feeling that she's got a story behind that. But we love to see boys taught to be respectful. It was said that as Charles grew up, his mother insisted on chauffeuring him every time he was on a date. She went as far as to call his date's parents to let them know that her son wouldn't do anything indecent. Wow, I can imagine that as a mother of girls, this would be so nice to know that the mother reassured them that her son would not treat a woman in any certain way. I only have boys myself, so I do my part in teaching my sons to be respectful and thankful for women. I also teach it by example and carrying myself a certain way to ensure my sons respect me, and I try my best so that they won't have issues with women in their futures. We just do what we can, right? They always say, raise a man that you would want your own daughter to marry, and that is what I try to do. People who were around Dell and Charles had thought that if she ever seemed overprotective, it was probably because she had never raised a child before. To which I say, there is no perfect way to raise a child, and we all do the best we can, hopefully. I, too, am a bit of an overprotective mom. But we know here in True Crime that your child can be raised with all sorts of abuse and trauma and end up a serial killer, or you can raise your child without any trauma or abuse, and they can still end up to be a serial killer. So, fingers crossed for all of us parents out there that our kids turn out fine. Dell wanted Charles to succeed so badly that he was expected to practice piano every morning for 30 minutes before the bus arrived, and she had taught him reading, writing, and math so much that he was able to skip 2 grade levels in elementary school. Dell also enrolled Charles in a taxidermy mail order class. The lessons started with the professor talking about how taxidermy was an art, not unlike sculpting or painting. Charles was about to work on his first dead bird, and his mother was right there at his side. It surprised me that she was so gung-ho about the taxidermy because she was so afraid for him to get polio from dog poop. I know that dead rodents and birds carry all sorts of diseases. I would not let my children do anything of the sort for that reason alone. Apparently, Dell showed Charles how to use all of the tools that were needed for taxidermy. There was said to be a scoop used for scooping out the brains, a scalpel that was required to cut away the eyes from their sockets. There was also forceps that pulled out the eyeballs. Apparently, she had even skinned the first bird for Charles and had taught him the depth and level to stop at. It was said that Charles would spend hours on the courses and stuffing his birds. He tried to make them as lifelike as possible. It said that the finishing touch was always the fake eyes. In fact, Charles was said to go to a local taxidermy shop and he would gaze at all of the different types of fake eyes for various animals. He had wished that he would have been able to collect these in the same way that other boys collected marbles. His mother, however, said they were too expensive, so she told him she had a cheaper and better way. She opened her sewing kit and would look for exactly what she needed, and then she would get to work. Then Charles and Dell would place the birds in their oak china cabinet that was placed in the front part of the house. It was said that everyone who had visited would come into their house and look into the cabinet to see his work. They were said to be beautiful and lifelike. None of the birds he had stuffed had the same set of eyes. His mother instead used buttons for eyes, and they would be sewn into the heads. Now we're going to jump ahead to December of 1990. So now we're going to talk about Mary Pratt, Charles's first alleged victim, who was said to be killed in December of 1990. Mary was found in a lower-class, underdeveloped area of South Dallas, and she was found naked except for a t-shirt and bra that were pushed up, exposing her breasts. Mary's eyes were shut, and her face was badly bruised, as well as her chest. Apparently, she had been beaten before the killer used a .44 caliber bullet in her head. When a neighbor resident found her, he was so disgusted by the horrific scene that he saw that he ran inside and brought out a bed sheet to cover her body. Good for him. When the police had arrived, the officer immediately recognized Mary, who was known to be a veteran sex worker, who was said to be 33 years old and worked out of a place called the Star Motel in Oak Cliff. The police had said that it was not unusual for sex workers in Oak Cliff to be beaten, unfortunately. They said almost nightly there would be a woman who would complain about a John, who would punch and kick them, and it was said some even tried to run them over with a car. They said for a sex worker to be murdered was unusual, especially when it came to someone who was so well liked, like Mary Pratt. From here on out, I'm going to use the word John. This article was written so long ago that they still used the word trick, and they also used awful words for sex workers, but I am uncomfortable saying those things, and now we know better, so I am going to say John for customers and sex worker. Mary hadn't been one of those types of sex workers who stood in the street flagging down Johns. Mary was someone who spent money on drugs, so she didn't have a whole lot of extra money. She usually just stood quietly on her corner. She was said to wear blue jeans, a small t-shirt that showed off her breasts, and tennis shoes. Sometimes at the end of the night, she would ask one of her regular customers to drive her over to her parents' home that was located in the suburb of Lancaster. Mary's parents didn't know anything about her other life. They would just yell to her and say goodnight before Mary would climb into her childhood bed. The homicide detective who was put on Mary's case was a man named John Westfalen. He was said to be determined as an investigator. Mary's murder was considered to be something called a, quote, dumped body case, which is one of the hardest murders to solve, apparently. It was apparent to them that Mary had been killed in one location and then dumped into another. No witnesses and no forensic evidence was seen. No apparent motive and no fingerprints made this case even more difficult to solve. Because the police knew the type of people who would come by the Star Motel on a nightly basis were those to be of questionable character, they were worried that she could have been shot by anyone who came to the motel. Westfalen's partner, who was a homicide detective named Stan McNear, drove together to the office of the medical examiner to watch the autopsy of Mary. A woman named Dr. Elizabeth Peacock, great name, who was a younger pathologist on the staff, had noticed that there were needle tracks on Mary's arm. She also saw a Playboy bunny tattoo on her chest. When Dr. Peacock opened up Mary's right eyelid, she exclaimed, quote, "My God, they're gone." The doctor noted that the eyeball itself was gone, as well as all the tissue. The eyes of Mary had been cut out with such care that there was no disturbance to either the upper or lower eyelids. Dr. Peacock was shocked. This was something that wasn't even taught in medical schools. It said that the killer had to know how to actually slip a knife around the eyeball and had to make sure not to injure the skin around them, cut all 6 major muscles that held each eye inside of the socket, and then would have had to cut the optical nerve, which was said to be as tough as rope. They knew that whoever had done this was someone who had a lot of practice on someone or something. The investigator Westphalen then contacted the FBI's Violent Crimes Apprehension Program Unit. The FBI keeps data on the nation's most depraved and uncommon mutilations, which included removed organs, mutilations of bodies such as cutting them up, and even if a victim's eyes are punctured as a result of a vicious attack. An FBI agent told the investigator there was no listing anywhere of such a surgically precise cutting. At this point, the investigator wondered what type of a person would want a woman's eyeballs. Now we're going to go back to September 1952. Charles had transferred to Arkansas State Teachers College in Arkansas. He quickly had become one of the school's most popular students. He was a well-rounded student and was even said to be the business manager of the yearbook, part of the school choir, played on the football team as a running back, and was actually president of the French club. Charles was said to be such a handsome person. When he signed up for a drawing class, the teacher actually made him the model for the class. I'm sure that didn't inflate his ego at all. Charles was said to be a college prankster despite the rule-following side of him. It was said that one time he snuck into the home ec building, grabbed a bunch of food out of the fridge, and then cooked a steak dinner for his friends. There was also said to be one time on a dare he had broken into the office of the physics professor, and this was in the middle of the day. He then picked the lock on the professor's cabinet and even stole a test that had been known around school to be completely unstealable. He then ran downtown and made a copy of the test and was able to return it within an hour. So the professor next door, who had been teaching, had no clue what had just taken place in his office. The balls on this dude, I was such a rule follower, you would not have caught me doing that at all, except for my rebellious side, like when I smoked and drank and did stupid stuff in high school. But as far as like school rules went, I never broke rules like that. I never wanted to get caught. I didn't want them to hate me. I wanted all the teachers to like me so I could get away with stuff. But that's just me. Charles had graduated from high school at the age of 15, and it was said that he was kind of a little celebrity. I guess it said when he was 14, his parents had bought a piece of property in their neighborhood and they gifted it to Charles. Well, Charles was smart. He sold it off so that he could buy more property, which led to the local newspaper called the Dallas Times-Herald publishing a story about Charles, and the headline read, quote, "World's youngest real estate man amassing nest egg for college," end quote. So naturally, I was like, what the hell does amassing mean? It means to gather together or accumulate a large amount or number of things over a period of time. But I guess it said that Charles had a little bit of a tainted reputation due to his mischievous little actions. For example, when he was in school, he shot rubber bands that he wasn't supposed to, or he once literally crawled out of study hall. One time, it said that he had quote-unquote accidentally set his chemistry teacher's dress on fire. Holy crap, that's scary. It also said that Charles had flunked some courses because he was bored in class, and he would say, "I'm too bored to study." He kept his mother from finding out, though, because she never would have let it go, so he sneaked into the school office and stole, which the article referred to as filched, some of the report cards from the desk in there and filled out the report cards with all A's. And then this little turd even signed his teachers' and principal's signatures so perfectly forged that his mother never even noticed. I mean, I hate to say this, but it's kind of brilliant. He was really a smart cookie. All of the things that he did in the area of like mischief were petty things, except for the fire, in my opinion, but he was never arrested or anything. Charles himself even said he never did mean things, he just did little mischievous things to show off for the older kids around him. Charles was once caught breaking into a church around his neighborhood. He was also once caught breaking into a small store, and he ended up stealing a watch. There was a man who, when Charles was younger, was a psychology student, but he worked part-time as a juvenile probation officer that would visit Charles and his mother. It was said that 40 years later, this student was a psychologist that was well known in the Dallas area. His name was Alfred Jones, and Jones claimed that he remembered Charles despite the fact that he had seen dozens of juveniles back in the 40s. He claimed to have remembered Charles very clearly in that he was able to turn off his reality sufficiently enough to be apart from his value system. And he's talking about Charles. He said that Charles could tell you something false and believed at the time that he was telling you that he was actually telling you the truth. Which, yikes, that is scary. I always wonder if it's things like this that make people quote-unquote psychopaths, where they are actually able to turn off their emotions. We hear it time and time again. Some thought the reason that Charles had this rebellious side might be because of his mother. Maybe the reason he stole things from little shops was because his mother was said to be so stingy. Dell was said to be a mother that liked to keep a close watch on her son. She was said to have taken him to church every Sunday and made him go to bed at a strict 8 p.m. bedtime, even when he was well into his teen years. Charles said when she would chauffeur him on dates, she would basically drive looking in the rearview mirror the entire time. Although Charles was very fond of his mother and loved her very much, some of the things she did bothered him. For example, he never knew if she was telling the truth about his biological mother, if she had actually been this brilliant student of law like Dell had told him. He also said that he could not stand his mother's cooking. It was said the way Dell fussed over Charles so much, it had started to give Charles headaches, to which Dell had, quote, decided the headaches were from bad eyesight and promptly made Charles wear glasses, even though he had 20/20 vision. Well, I can imagine that wearing glasses that you don't need would give you headaches more than anything else. But really, the articles and stories were just painting the picture of Charles's home life as he grew up. When Charles was enrolled in North Texas State College in Denton, he was arrested towards the end of his freshman year for being a part of a student-led burglary ring that had been caught breaking into 3 different stores and had stolen hundreds of dollars worth of items. Charles said when this happened that he was innocent and swore that he had never stolen anything. He gave the story that the other boys had asked him to keep some of their items in his dorm room for them and that he didn't know they were stolen. Now, this part was interesting to me. Talk about a mother's devotion. It said that when this happened, Dell tried to pay back the store owners for what he had taken, or what was taken. She tried to convince the judge to let her be Charles's lawyer, and then she even asked if she could take his place in prison. Obviously, all of those things didn't fly, and Charles ended up being put in prison for a year. But man, I completely understand the thought process of wanting to protect your child so much. It is so hard to watch your children go through hardships. I can't imagine seeing your only son carted off to prison. But he does need to learn his own lessons at this point, it seems. Dell apparently worked hard to keep this debacle quiet so no one in the neighborhood would know that Charles had become a convicted felon. So, needless to say, he had started college in North Texas College in Denton, but then was kicked out because of this, and that is why he started at the Arkansas State Teachers College. When Charles was able to start at the Arkansas State Teachers College, he told his probation officer that he was going to be on the up and up, and even began to date a woman named Betty Hester, and made plans to marry her. Charles was said to be simply amazing in science, even though he didn't study much. Because Charles had earned an A in his human anatomy course, everyone had thought that Charles was going to go far in life, and Charles had even spoke of starting medical school, and he even thought about becoming a surgeon. Despite doing so well in school, Charles was still a class clown and still wanted to make people laugh. One of the biggest pranks he ever pulled was on a friend that had broken up with a girlfriend who was said to have almond eyes. After they had split up, Charles's friend ripped up a few of her pictures and he threw them away. A few weeks later, when his friend had gotten a new girlfriend, he had asked his new girlfriend for a picture that he could have. One night, while Charles's friend was looking at the picture of his new girlfriend, he realized something was off with it. When he was able to look at the photo closer, he realized that the eyes had been cut out and replaced with his ex-girlfriend's almond eyes. He freaked. His friend could not believe what he was looking at, and then he had looked up and saw more of his ex-girlfriend's eyes staring at him. They were also said to be found above the urinal inside of the men's bathroom that was down the hall. It was a story that went around school, and no one thought anything sinister of this prank. They knew it was just inventive enough to be Charles. They figured out that he had taken the photos out of the trash and saved the eyeballs for a perfect moment to prank his friend. Now we're going back to December of 1990. In December of 1990, the police at this time had not released any information about Mary's missing eyes. In fact, the only report that came out on her case was a tiny 2-paragraphed section in the back pages of the newspaper, which is so sad. There were 2 patrol officers named John Matthews and Regina Smith, who had started their shift just a few hours after Mary's body was found, and they hadn't even heard about the crime. It was this pair of patrol officers that usually was assigned to the downtrodden area by the Star Motel where the sex workers worked and lived and usually did drugs. Regina Smith, although a single mother herself, was a black female officer who had known the need of a female black officer in the area and worked very hard herself to earn her badge. Good for her. She had even made a photo book of mugshots of the sex workers around, and she would talk to them often, wanting to help make anyone's life better. When Smith and Matthews pulled into the area to talk to one of the local sex workers that they seemed to know pretty well, a woman named Veronica Rodriguez, who was only 26 years old, was said to live an already miserable life. She had a gash across her forehead and a thin knife cut across the front of her neck. Rodriguez told the officers that the night before, a John picked her up, then drove south for a very long distance, and the man proceeded to rape her. She then said after he raped her, he tried to kill her, but she was able to escape. She described the man as white. When she escaped, she was able to run to a nearby house. The man who answered the door happened to be someone she actually knew, and he also happened to know the man who had just tried to kill her. When Matthews and Smith heard this, they were concerned as Rodriguez was known to be somewhat of a notorious liar. They could tell that she had been in a scuffle, but they were iffy on whether to believe that she was in the middle of nowhere and just happened to find a house of someone she knew. They figured this might be just another one of Rodriguez's story that she used to make the cops feel sorry for her, and then in turn, they would leave her alone. 2 days after this run-in with Rodriguez, they saw her sitting with a middle-aged, balding white man, and they were both in the cab of an 18-wheeler. As one of the officers escorted Rodriguez to the patrol car, she told the other officer who stayed back to talk to the man not to arrest him because he was the man who had helped her the night that she was almost killed. She stated that he saved her from the killer. When the officers took a look at the man's address on his license, they saw that he didn't live downtown south of Dallas, like Rodriguez had said, but in fact, he lived not far from the Star Motel at all. The man in the truck seemed nervous and said that he had no idea what Rodriguez was talking about, but that he had just known her for years and said he was just giving her a ride to the motel. He said he had not protected her from any killer, nor did he have sex with her. He said he was just a long-distance truck driver that had been doing her a favor. Again, the police decided that Rodriguez was lying, and they carted her off to jail for prostitution, and they also brought in the man who was with her, named Schindler, for some unpaid tickets that he had. Matthew and Smith would not end up knowing for months, but they had just had a clue as to who the murderer was, and it had fallen right into their laps. Back in September of 1969, Charles was 36 years old when he had begun to be a teacher at a high school in the subject of science in Crandall, which was a small town that was east of Dallas. The principal at this school had been searching for a teacher all summer long, so he was very excited when he got a call from Charles right before the beginning of the school year. Charles had college records that stated that he had a master's degree in biology from East Texas State University, and that he was also working on another master's degree in guidance and counseling. It also said that he was about to enter a PhD program in biology at that same college that he had had his master's from. Charles was a teacher who students found fascinating. When he would take them on field trips, he would recite for them in perfect Latin the scientific names for every plant that they would come across. He would also cut open different logs that were rotting out, and he could talk about each insect inside that they found. Charles was said to wear lizard skin shoes to teach, and he drove a green Corvette. Some of the females found themselves charmed by him and thought that he was handsome, and they would write him love letters. Oh my God, the balls on these girls. Wow. Anytime I ever saw a teacher that I thought was cute, I just sat there so awkwardly staring at him and trying not to be a moron if I was ever called on. Never would I ever have had the courage to write him a love letter. It would later be found out that this all-around seemingly great teacher was completely full of shit. In fact, the school would find out Charles had never earned a bachelor's degree, let alone a master's at East State, Texas University, and that he in fact snuck into 3 different offices at the university, snatched the forms he needed, made copies of them, forged the signatures needed, then snuck them back into the files. Apparently, he had even taken the registrar's typewriter so that the fonts would match on the record. And in fact, if an administrator that had worked at the university had not realized that she had not met a man named Charles Albright, even though his name kept popping up on the university's list of graduate students, then Charles may have never been caught for a scam. It was at this point he was confronted about what he had done, and he admitted to it. He said that he had to do this in order to get a teaching job, and his now wife, Betty, had already given birth to their daughter, and that he didn't have time to start all over at the university. Charles had been kicked out of school for theft when he was caught with various suitcases stuffed with stolen property from the school, and this even included his own football coach's golf clubs. He said he didn't think that he would get another chance to prove his wits, which is a shame because he was extremely smart. I feel like this is another one of those cases like the Golden State Killer who didn't need the money, and that's not why they stole things, but they stole rather for like the thrill, which then escalated to rape, which then escalated to rape and murder. This is the exact same thing. It started with petty theft, and it was something that they couldn't control and then probably continued to escalate until murder. It was said, since the forgery was a victimless crime and because the administrator at Eastern Texas State University thought that Charles was such a nice, remorseful man, the university had decided to keep the whole thing out of the newspapers. It could have embarrassed the university as well that this man was able to pull one over at the school. Charles did, however, plead guilty to a charge of fraud, and then he received 1 year of probation. In the 70s, Charles lived back in his old neighborhood in Dallas that was actually not far from his parents' house. No one around the neighborhood had any idea of what Charles had done. The Charlie that the neighbors knew was smart, happy-go-lucky guy, didn't really care to have a 9-to-5 job. Charles had some money from his parents, plus his wife was a high school teacher for an English class. Apparently, Charles rarely had a job that lasted longer than 3 months, so he was able to move from project to new project without a care in the world. He had various jobs at this time, like working as an illustrator for a patent company, working as a designer for a company that built airplanes. He was a carpenter. He made baseball bats. He even worked in a Mexican border town as a bullfighter for a while. Crazy. He had, at one point, collected wine bottles from famous restaurants in Dallas, and he had hoped to start his own winery, and he also collected old movie posters. It said that he would regularly go down to the Venetian room at the local Fairmont Hotel, and he would get autographs from the stars that performed there. Charles was a master of many trades. He had visited a friend of his that had worked in a beauty salon at a department store, and then right after, Charles decided to go to beauty school. He was able to get his license, and he was so charming and witty that he was able to persuade a salon to hire him without any experience at all as a stylist. He was said to spend about an hour with each woman to get their hair exactly right. As a former stylist myself, well, I guess I still have my license, I just can't do hair anymore because of my back. Taking an hour with a client is a long time. And no offense, it is not worth the small tip. You can bust out a few haircuts in an hour and make way better money. Anyways, when Charles had told one of his fellow stylist friends that he was an accomplished artist, the friend hired him to paint a portrait of his wife for $250. Charles was actually said to be a phenomenal painter, and he even won a prize at a state fair for the portrait that he had painted. Charles had worked for weeks on his friend's wife's portrait, but hadn't finished yet. He kept telling his friend that he needed to keep working on this one special feature that was the hardest part of all of the painting. Well, his friend got sick of waiting and decided to go look at what was finished on the painting. When his friend walked in, he took a look at the painting that had been standing in the middle of the living room. It was a huge 6-foot by 3-foot painting and was said to be, quote, richly colored and remarkably realistic. The woman's hair, mouth, her nose, her ears, her neck, everything was finished. Well, not everything. The stylist stared curiously at his wife's painting. In the center of the wife's face, there were 2 round white holes. End quote. Ew, the way they build this guy up with eyeballs is creepy as hell. When his friend then asked when he was going to paint the eyeballs, Charles replied with an answer of, when I'm ready to. It was a few months later Charles had finally painted the eyes. Then he painted them again, just to get them right. Everything down to the shadows, the shading, the shape, everything about the eyes were so perfect and stunning that they seemed to follow a person across the room. February 1991. We're jumping ahead a little. Susan Peterson was the second sex worker victim found in February of 1991. She was found in the morning on the same road where Mary Pratt was found. Susan was also mostly naked, and she too was a sex worker who was at the age of 27. She had been shot in the head, her chest, and the stomach. Her eyelids were also closed. The jurisdiction for this case fell onto the sheriff's department because she was found on the other end of that road that was just outside the city limits. The detective that was on the case was named Larry Oliver, and he was not made aware of Mary Pratt's case. So basically the same thing happened where Oliver went with the body to the autopsy, where the pathologist had started the initial examination. This is where they discovered that the victim's eyeballs had been cut out. At this point, the pathologist had mentioned that the Dallas PD had just had a similar case, and within 24 hours, Oliver had traveled to the Dallas PD to visit with Westfalen from the previous Mary Pratt case. While there was a meeting of different PD homicide personnel, they were careful to avoid saying the word serial killings, but instead they used the word repeater to describe the killings. Everyone there knew exactly who they were going to be searching for, a highly intelligent, twisted killer who dropped off the bodies into a quiet residential street where they would definitely be found the next day. This was the point where it was going to try to be kept quiet about the killings, in fear that the media would point to the Star Motel and that this would cause the killer to stop going there and start getting women from somewhere else instead. However, the homicide supervisory team decided that they felt that they had a greater obligation to warn the community that people could be in danger, even if that meant warning what they considered to be low-dollar sex workers. The way they talk about sex workers on some of these interviews is just disturbing, and it bothers me that they seem to look down on them with such disgust that they weren't even human beings. So I'm going to keep using the comfortable terms that I'm okay with and disregard those crappy little tidbits because that's just not okay. A job is a job. Whether you like it or not does not give us the right to look down on anyone. It is their lives. Let them live it. Anyways, the authorities had hopes. If they did go ahead and publicize the case, maybe they would get some leads that they desperately needed. There were flyers posted around the Star Motel warning sex workers to stay off the streets. When the authorities gave a press conference about these killings, they did not reveal any information about the missing eyes, but somehow that information was leaked to the press that the women's faces were mutilated in a strange way. One detective even told the reporter that the guy responsible for these killings had done things in an almost surgical way. This began an absolute media nightmare, and calls started pouring in from reporters that came from all over the country. The officers Matthew and Smith, who had worked in the area, had known Susan Peterson. They had said that she was a beautiful white sex worker who wore brown boots and a denim miniskirt. They said that she could easily pick up 10 to 12 Johns a night and was an expert in snagging money off the Johns while she worked. They thought that if the killer was able to get Susan, then he could get and kill any of them. They knew that the killer must have been a regular customer and had to have known all of the sex workers' districts because he was able to pick up Susan and be gone in seconds. In their minds, Susan must have known the attacker because she let her guard down. They thought if she hadn't known him and he pointed a gun at her, surely she would have taken out a razor and put up a good fight. When the officers Matthew and Smith had pulled up to the Star Motel, the sex workers didn't avoid them as usual. They came out of everywhere from the motel and surrounded the squad car. They started giving their own personal list of Johns that they thought could be the killer. They gave the names of the Johns with the kinkiest requests, men who wanted to tie them up or even wanted to whip them. When Officer Smith gave her usual talk to these women about getting off the streets, the black sex workers didn't care. They said back to Officer Smith, quote, "He's after the white girls, honey, not us," end quote. In a weird way, the black sex workers saw this as a way for them to drum up more business for themselves. This is what it said in the report. I am not saying this. I just want to be clear on that. Veronica Rodriguez, who was the sex worker we spoke about before with the strange encounter from a man who she said tried to kill her, she had been telling many people, other sex workers, reporters, police officers, and even Matthews and Smith themselves, many different stories since the killings had begun. One story was how she had allegedly witnessed Mary Pratt being shot and that she had met the man who'd bragged about killing Mary. Then she would turn around and say that she knew nothing about Mary's death at all. When Rodriguez would refer to her own rape that happened in South Dallas, she no longer said that the man was white, but rather now that he was Hispanic. Then she stated he could have even been black. Apparently, people who spoke to Rodriguez all thought the same thing, that her brain had been fried from all of the drugs that she had done. Something that didn't sit right with Officer Matthews was that Rodriguez's story stayed the same about how she was attacked. Something that she apparently did often was forget whatever pity story that she had said the day before, but for whatever reason, this time it was not changing. Officer Matthews thought to himself, could she really have been attacked and almost killed? Then he wondered if the man she claimed to help her, Axton Schindler, who lived at 1035 El Dorado, maybe he actually did know something, or maybe he actually had something to do with the killings. Maybe he knew about the killer. It was said that Smith and Matthews provided the information, which was their job, about Rodriguez claiming to have information on Mary's murder, and they said that she could have been attacked and that a man named Axton Schindler could be connected to it somehow. They passed the information along because they themselves were not allowed to go any further because it would cross into homicide jobs or investigation. Later on, Westfalen said that he never received the tips that had come from the pair of officers. Apparently, with all the phone calls, messages, and reports flooding in, he had never even heard the name Axton Schindler. Now we're going back. I hope you can see the pattern now. We're going to go forward and backwards because there's 3 murders, and I want to tell you different things about him before we get to each next murder. So by March of 1985, Charles had already been in trouble for petty theft, forging cashier's checks, and now he had committed a new crime and was about to serve 10 years probation. But there would be no story for this crime. If this crime were to have been known, he would have been destroyed, humiliated, and done. He kept insisting that this family that he had met back in 1979 through the St. Bernard's Catholic Church in East Dallas, that he was friends with them. He was on the choir, which led him to being somewhat of a minister who stood before the church altar in a robe and helped with communion and also read some Bible passages. Everyone thought that Charles was such a great man who loved to help people. He would even sneak a $100 bill into someone's pocket at church that he felt was down on their luck and could use the money. When Charles met the said family, he brought them a large box of steaks. He also dressed up as Santa Claus and gave one particular little girl and her siblings presents. Well, he was accused of sneaking into the little girl's room and molesting her. The girl's parents didn't want anyone from the church to find out about this, as they thought that it would stigmatize the girl, and in fact, they tried to keep this whole thing quiet altogether. However, her family wanted Charles to pay for what he had done. Charles was afraid if the family had fought him, that word would get out, so instead he stood in front of the judge in a nearly empty courtroom and confessed to, quote, knowingly and intentionally engaging in deviant sexual intercourse, end quote. The girl was under the age of 14 and Charles was 51. What a sick fuck. I can completely understand not wanting to stigmatize your daughter. However, I would want this piece of shit's face plastered all over the place as a child molester because I wouldn't want him to get away with doing it again. I'm not 100% on how this works, but to my understanding, they can keep minors' names out of papers and media and just focus on Charles. I feel like I would have anonymously called a newspaper and not mentioned my child's name, but I would have called Charles out in a fucking heartbeat. This was the first time that people got a glimpse of the other side to quote-unquote good old Charlie. Charles divorced Betty in 1975. He said that it was a loveless marriage, and after this, he had developed somewhat of a reputation of being some sort of a ladies' man. Charles was said to be still working the odd jobs and still received family money, but women had thought him to be romantic as he showered them with candy, flowers, and music boxes. Women were in awe as they usually thought him to be sexy and virile? I don't know what that word is. But Charles maintained to his friends that he never made a sexual advance towards any woman unless they had asked him to do so, like some kind of weird flex. In the later part of 1985, Charles fell in love with a woman named Dixie Austin, who was said to be shy but pretty. This was said to be one of the most romantic times in Charles's life. Dixie would later say that sex with Charles was gentle and satisfying. Charles was seemingly living another life by the time he met Dixie and was able to maintain his secret from anyone and everyone who knew him. What secret, you may ask? The fact that Charles was said to be a regular of red light districts all over Dallas. Some sex workers knew him as a regular John who showed up often, but to others, like Susan Peterson, he was a sugar daddy. A company that Charles used to help Susan get out on bond whenever she was arrested, Charles was listed as a co-signer. She had also listed him as her best friend if she were to skip town and then needed to be hunted down. There was also evidence that Charles may have been a friend of Mary Pratt's, way before she became a sex worker. It was said in the early 80s, Mary had lived in a neighborhood where Charles's parents had invested in some cheap rental properties. When Mary lived nearby, Charles had lived in one temporarily, and many sources say that Charles had a little fling with one of Mary's friends, and because of this, the pair of women were invited to Charles's parties. Some sex workers stated that when Mary became a sex worker, working out of the Star Motel, that Charles was one of her customers. Mary had referred to him to the other sex workers as, quote, old man Albright, end quote. And she told them he was a good customer and that he was willing to pay a little above the going rate. It was not long after this that Charles made his rounds among the sex workers. Some women had a platonic relationship with him. He would take them and have a nice chat, take them to eat a hamburger, and then take them back. No sex involved. However, with others, he would have a standing appointment, which was always in the afternoon because Dixie was working as a clerk in a gift shop at the mall. There was one woman in particular who was married, but this woman would hit the streets right after her husband went off to work and her children had gone off to school. She said that Charles had always felt sorry for her and that he would even drop off money if she was in need. She also said that by late 1987, she had to stop having dates with Charles because he had begun to get a little more aggressive. She had stated that he asked her to beat him and spank him like a little kid, which is, I'm not trying to kink shame because to each their own, but when you know where this is going, it's gross. Another sex worker named Edna recounted a time where she and Susan Peterson were asked to do a double with Charles, to where he handcuffed them to the bed and began to hit them with a belt and an extension cord while he yelled, quote, "Scream, bitch, you know you like it," end quote. Yikes. It was said that after Charles's parents passed is when his life started to spin out of control. It said that without his parents to look out for him, there was a seemingly repressed part of him that really started to come out and unleash itself after their deaths. It was said that his mother, Dell, who had died in 1981 from cancer, was not very close to Charles towards the end of her years. Dell was apparently disappointed in how Charles had turned out, and Charles saw Dell as a pest. But he still loved his mother, and after she passed, he asked the undertaker. Side note, I didn't know that that's what a person who prepares dead body is called. Did you? He asked him to put on his mother this new dress that Charles had went out and bought for her, which was the first new dress he had ever seen his mother in. It was said that he wept openly during her funeral in maybe what was grief or what was maybe guilt for letting her down. After Dell's death, Charles and his father finally became close, but when Fred died a few years later, Charles cried at his funeral as well. After his parents passed, Charles inherited at least $96,000, and he also received all of his parents' properties and homes in South Dallas. To make some money, he rented out some of the smaller homes, one to a man named Axton Schindler. At this point, Charles decided to move back into his family home in Oak Cliff, which, while needed a new paint job and a little makeover, Charles thought would do just perfectly for him and his new love, Dixie, to spend a quiet and romantic life in. The address was 1035 El Dorado. We're going to jump ahead to March of 1991. Shirley Williams, the third sex worker victim. All of a sudden, on March 19th, 1991, it had seemed that the killer had changed their tactics. If you think about it, these killings were all within a few months of each other. A sex worker named Shirley Williams came out from the Avalon Motel, where she was a maid by day and a sex worker by night. Someone who had seen her had said that she was wearing jeans and a yellow raincoat, but had also appeared completely whacked out on a drug high as she stumbled around on the sidewalk. At 6:20 a.m. the next morning, Shirley was found on a residential street that had been about a block and a half away from an elementary school in Oak Cliff. As children walked to school, there was Shirley in plain view, a naked woman that was crumpled up against the curb, which to me was just disgusting and so sad and traumatic for those kids. Just, your actions have consequences for so many people. I hope that we all realize what we do can affect many people. There, beside her, laid an unopened condom. When Westfalen arrived to the scene, he asked the ME to go see if her eyeballs were in there. The ME stated they were gone. What a sick little fucker, though, to leave them there where the children were walking by and see her. It's just absolutely sickening. I couldn't get over that. He kind of just stole their innocence because of being a psychopath. When they did the autopsy of Shirley, they saw that her eye removal had been hurried. There was a broken tip of an X-Acto blade that had been found embedded near her right eye in the skin. However, there was still no fingerprints, no witnesses, and no murder weapons found. This was just as the police were afraid. Now that the word was out about the case, it sent the killer away from the Star Motel and the place where he was dropping off the bodies. Both the motel and the body dropping site were new places. Westfalen was able to fill up 4 spiral notebooks with notes on this sex worker murder case. They put out special undercover units that would basically stake out the sex worker spots to see if they could run any license plates that would maybe turn up any unusual crime records, but nothing ever came of it. Westfalen said that there were 3 specific questions they needed to figure out about the murders. Why was the killer targeting sex workers? Why did he always leave the bodies on the same street? And why oh why were the eyeballs cut out? Many of the detectives threw out theories for Westfalen, like maybe the killer had gotten AIDS from a sex worker. Maybe he believed that an old superstition, like when people are killed, the image of their killer remains on their eyeballs forever. Maybe the killer wanted to eat the eyeballs or cook them. The only thing that Westfalen had known for sure was that this killer always came out at night. He was strong because he was able to drag these women to and from his car, and that this man had surgical skills. Someone mentioned this killer could have been a psychotic doctor. Fast forward to October 1990. Charles worked as a carpenter. October 1st, he did something odd, even for him. He took a job delivering newspapers in the middle of the night. He told Dixie, who was living with him, that they needed more money for spending. He was not good with finances, and the 4 short years since his parents had died, he had gone through all of his inheritance, and he still didn't have a full-time job. Dixie paid most of their bills with the money that she made at the gift shop, and she also received a life insurance check, but I could not figure out from who or from what circumstance. So Charles would wake up at 3 a.m. and deliver papers on a route in Oak Cliff and then be back to bed by 6:15. Charles was, at this time, a part of 2 softball teams, one at day and one at night, and he would take trips with these teams, and that's what he would use the newspaper money for. No one ever saw him get upset because he was such a likable guy. However, at least 2 men had confirmed that they did see Charles's mask slip again. One time after finishing a game, the team was standing around eating candy that Charles had brought with them when 2 women drove slowly by in a car. As the men were joking that these women could have been sex workers, the team manager joked and said Charlie was single and asked him why didn't he go after one of them. To which Charles said, quote, "Hell, I'd kill them if I could." The team was so stunned to hear this that they turned around to look at their seemingly mild-mannered friend. They said on his face was a dark, scowling look. It gave me the EBs when I read that. Oh, it freaked me out. The manager asked Charles what he meant. He was just trying to keep the conversation light. The manager then said that they have to have sex workers, and it keeps men from chasing married women. Apparently, Charles snapped back with, "The hell it does." Then it was said that he walked and got into his car and left. I guess this was the first time that anyone had seen Charles show any kind of anger. I'm sure that it was shocking and weird for them. I guess the next time that the team was together, the manager tried to apologize and say they were just kidding around, to which Charles said it was a touchy subject for him because his mother was a sex worker. He was not referring to Dell, but rather his biological mother. No one knew if he was telling the truth or not. Many people have tried to verify if this was true, even an FBI agent, but all they could learn about her was that she was a nurse who had lived in Wichita Falls. Charles's relatives said that after a long process of trying to find his biological mother, he was able to track her down and was thrilled to meet her. He had apparently met her on several occasions and had introduced her to his own daughter and his father, Fred, before he passed. As for Charles and the murders, he had everything perfectly in place to be able to commit the crimes. He had his paper route, he had some sort of motive against sex workers, some twisted thoughts when it came to women, whether it be about his biological mother issues or his adopted mother issues. Something was broken there. He also had kept the house him and Dixie were living in, his childhood home, in his father's name, so nothing would be traced back to him. The only flaw in his plans to murder was one that he didn't even know existed. The man he had rented one of the houses to, Axton Schindler, didn't want to list his actual address on his license because he liked to keep things very private. So instead, he listed 1035 El Dorado, which was the address for Charles Albright. Back on the beat, Officers Smith and Matthews saw that the Star Motel had become a ghost town in fear of this killer. They passed a sex worker they both knew to have been on the streets for a good 17 years. She liked to work alone in front of a church and away from all of the other sex workers. When Smith and Matthews pulled up to her and asked if she knew about the murders and that the killer was now killing black and white women alike, this woman named Brenda White told the officer that she planned on getting her black ass out of there. She told the officers that she had had a man who had, quote, jumped bad on me the other night, end quote. She said that a few days before she had a John pick her up. She got into his dark station wagon. She said that he was a man in cowboy boots and blue jeans with salt and pepper hair and was a husky-looking white man. She said that this man asked her to go to a motel. She said she replied with no and that she had a spot they could use. She said that she never allowed a John to take her anywhere but a sex worker motel because she wanted to protect herself. So she told him to drop her off immediately. She said all of a sudden his face changed and he looked enraged. And he said, quote, I hate whores. I'm going to kill all of you motherfucking whores, end quote. And before this man even had a chance to grab her, she sprayed him in the face with mace, threw the door open, and jumped out. She had stated she broke the heel of her favorite red leather high heels. Yes, girl, good for you. I love a good getaway story. The next day, as the officers were checking in for their shift, they couldn't shake the stories of Brenda or Rodriguez, who had claimed to be raped that one evening and gave them the name of Axton Schindler as her hero. They decided to check Schindler's name through the county government computer because they contained more information about the people than just the city computers. So they went to the county constable's office and enlisted the help of a deputy that was on duty named Walter Cook. When they used that computer, Fred Albright popped up instead of Axton Schindler. Confused, they found out that Fred Albright also owned the property on a street with the name of Cotton Valley, which was the very same neighborhood where the first two sex workers were found. However, they also saw a man named Fred Albright. He was dead. The only actual clue they had to this weird case was a man who was already dead. After Cook said, maybe it could have something to do with this man that they see on there, named Charles Albright. A few weeks prior to this, Cook explained to the officers that he had come in early to the office one morning, and he had answered a call from a woman who would not share her identity, but she said that she had been a friend of Mary Pratt's, and that through Mary she had met this man and that they had dated briefly. She stated that the man was very nice, but something was weird about him and that he had an odd love for eyes. She also just happened to mention that he had X-Acto knives that he kept in his attic. When Cook asked for the man's name, she said Charles Albright. This excited Smith and Matthews as they felt they might be getting closer. When they looked into Charles's background, they saw the records of theft, burglaries, forgeries, and they also saw the charge of having sexual intercourse with a child. When they looked at Charles's mugshot, they saw a handsome man with grayish hair, deep-set and rather dark eyes, just as the man that Brenda White had described. When Smith and Matthews decided to take their information to Homicide Detective Westfallen, they were nervous as they just had figured out who the killer was, but had no proof. Westfallen apparently greeted them politely, listened to them, and knew that they had something real. He put together a photo lineup of 6 mugshots and asked Smith and Matthews to show Brenda White. Smith and Matthews were able to find Brenda on her normal street, and they asked her if she recognized anyone from the mugshots of men. She didn't hesitate to point out Charles's picture and stated that he was the man who attacked her. Later on, they had showed the same lineup to Rodriguez and asked her if she recognized anyone. Matthews said that when she got to Charlie's picture, she started trembling, and then she refused to identify anyone. When Matthews called Westfallen to tell him the bad news that Rodriguez was so afraid of the killer that she wouldn't even pick out his picture from the lineup, he asked the officers to bring her in. Westfallen had known that without Rodriguez's help, they would only be able to charge Charles with the charge of a misdemeanor from Brenda. However, if Rodriguez would agree to identify him, then the police would charge Charles with attempted murder, which would allow them to get a search warrant, and at that point, they could search his house for any evidence that may link him to those 3 murders. When Westfallen got Rodriguez into an interrogation room, he could tell that she was a crack addict. She started shaking and crying, and she wouldn't even look at the pictures that he had put in front of her. Westphalen had to try to control his anger and try another angle with her. Instead, he told her about the 3 women and how they were brutally murdered, and how the authorities wouldn't be able to get this killer off the streets unless she helped them. He told Rodriguez that this was an easy task and that all she had to do was pick the picture of the man that hurt her, and they would put him in jail, and that he would not be able to hurt her again. I can understand her hesitation, though, even though I would want to nail this guy's ass to the wall. You could also be afraid that if they somehow can't get him for anything, that maybe he would come back and kill you. I get it. She finally, slowly looked at the photos, turned Charles's photo over, and signed her name. At 2:30 a.m. on March 22nd, a team of tactical officers busted down the front door of the address 1035 El Dorado. As they handcuffed Charles and took him away, he never said one word. Dixie came out in her nightgown. She didn't know what her love had done, and she began to scream. December of 1991. Charles refused to confess to anything. He tried to act as if he had never even so much as heard the name of the sex workers who were killed. The authorities meticulously searched each property thoroughly, and with the Oak Cliff house, they actually searched it 6 times. The FBI had even brought out a machine that helped them be able to see through walls, but no matter how much they searched, they could not find the eyeballs. They had found some interesting things, though, like the X-Acto blades, a copy of Grey's Anatomy, woodworking blades, true crime stories, books, and they had even found a stash of pistols and rifles in a hidden compartment behind a hand-built fireplace that Charles had made. Unfortunately, none of these matched the murder weapon. Many that were involved in this case were afraid that they may not have enough evidence to convict him of murder. There was also no witnesses who would admit to seeing Charles with any of the 3 sex workers the nights of the murders. Charles hadn't left for his paper route shift early, nor did he ever come home late from it. When the trial date came, Veronica Rodriguez had decided to testify as a witness for the defense. She had claimed that her and Charles had never been together, and that Westphalen had in fact coerced her into picking his photo from the lineup. Axton Schindler also denied that he had saved her from Charles. He said there was a Hispanic man by the name of Joe who had brought her to his door. A 33-year-old prosecutor by the name of Toby Shook was working for the DA. This was going to be the first time in its history that the DA was going to use controversial hair samples taken from the bodies of the dead sex workers and use it against Charles's hair to show that they were similar samples from his head and his pubic region. Although hairs are not fingerprints, they were still able to tell that the hairs found on the blankets in the back of Charles's truck were similar to Mary and Susan's hair, and hair inside of Charles's vacuum was similar to Shirley's. Officers Smith and Matthews were able to help when they found a sex worker named Tina Connolly, who had said that Charles was one of her pretty regular afternoon clients, who she had never seen come out at night except for one time, which was the night that Shirley Williams disappeared. Tina then took the officers to a secluded field that Charles would take her for sex, and there they saw a yellow raincoat, just like the one that Shirley was last seen wearing, and a blanket there as well. The hairs on the coat and blanket matched Charles's hair. Charles's defense tried to convince the jury that the DA had nothing but thin circumstantial evidence against Charles and that the real killer could be Axton Schindler, who had just happened to skip town during the week of the trial. It was true that the authorities had many unanswered questions about this Axton Schindler person, and while Westphalen had spent hours upon hours interrogating the man, they tried to decide whether Schindler had actually helped Charles with the killings, or at the very least, were aware of them. However, there was nothing to tie him to the cases except for an empty box of .44 caliber ammo behind the house, which he rented, which could have been dropped there by Charles himself. When Schindler and Charles's photos were shown to the sex workers, none of them recognized Schindler, but many of them recognized Charles. No hairs were connected to Schindler, and anyone who knew him had thought there was no way he could remove the eyeballs the way the killer did. Charles never testified. It said that he sat quietly through the entire trial with his shoulders slumped to make him look like he was weak and humble. While the prosecution made their closing arguments, the prosecutor warned the jury to not underestimate Charles and that he had grown much smarter during this entire trial and that if he were to be let go, he would not make the same mistakes again. On December 19th, the jury came back with a guilty verdict and also a life sentence. It was said that Dixie collapsed in the courtroom. Charles's friends avoided the press. They almost made it look like they didn't want to be blamed for knowing such a horrendous killer and didn't really know who he was. Charles's lawyer seemed surprised by the verdict, and when he walked out of the courtroom, he said, quote, "It's always a miscarriage of justice when an innocent man is convicted," end quote. He told his interviewer that he was confident that he would win the appeal case. He said that a new judge would see through the lies that had been told at the first trial. Charles said to the interviewer he couldn't complain about prison life. He was reading books, wanted to write a book about the wives of the Civil War generals, and that he was coaching the prison softball team. I don't like that. Why do they get softball teams? I don't like to think of a person in prison and them being, it's like, oh, it's like a place where it's just fine being there. It's not supposed to be fun. It's supposed to suck, so that people won't want to go back there, and maybe they'll figure out ways to not be a criminal if they ever get out. Charles then told his interviewer that he had never touched an eyeball, and that he thought that the forensic teams cut out the eyeballs so that they could have some sort of mutilation. Whatever Charles did or knew, he was not going to tell. Why would such a seemingly nice and charismatic man want to cut out the eyeballs of sex workers? What was his obsession with eyes? When he was a kid and he wanted to collect those taxidermy eyes of animals, maybe he was trying to start a collection of his own? Charles died at the West Texas Regional Medical Facility in 2020. And that, my friends, is the horrific, yucky, freaky-ass story of Charles Albright, the man who murdered sex workers and snatched their eyeballs. This was a really long episode, so I'm not going to have a lot of closing thoughts, but I am just going to ask this one question, and I want to leave you guys with it, and I hope that you'll share your theories on the Kill File socials. Where are the eyeballs? That's all I want to know. Where are they? Why did they not find them? If this man made a fireplace where he was able to stash weapons, I have no doubt in my mind that one day somebody's going to find a bunch of eyeballs. Actually, I don't know what happens to them. Like, do they just shrivel up? I remember dissecting a cow's eye in second grade, but I am by no means an expert and am still haunted by the images of that. What happens to eyeballs when they're left out to dry? Or maybe he kept them in a jar. But if this man was smart enough to make some kind of fireplace like that, then I have no doubt in my mind that he was able to create a stash somewhere where he kept his things. It seemed like he was meticulous and he was not stupid. So those eyeballs are somewhere and I want to know where. Where do you think they are? I will see you guys next time. Bye. Well, that's it for today, guys. Thank you so much for hanging out with me today and listening to another episode of The Kill File. If you want to share your thoughts on what we covered today, suggest a case for me to check out, or if you're just bored and looking for something to do, you can head over to The Kill File's social medias and reach out. We're on Facebook and Instagram as The Kill File, and we're on YouTube and TikTok as The Kill File Podcast. Also, feel free to check out our website at thekillfile.com, where you can learn more about me, your host, and a little bit more about how The Kill File got started. I love hearing from you guys. Come back on Mondays, wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts, when we will cover another case on The Kill File, where nothing stays buried forever. Stay safe, you guys. Bye!